recording this. We are recording this session. Please let us know in the chat if you do not like to be part of the recording with your face and/or your name, because we can then remove you from the recording. But the idea is that everybody that was not able to make it today can also watch this back. So and it's part of our knowledge building on this important topic. I'm very happy to welcome all of you today to our webinar called No Such Thing as Free Coffee. And the webinar today is on unpaid work in the gig economy. And even though we will be discussing some of the issues that we've been seeing coming from a major research project called Respect Me, we also will be diving into some solutions and some practical best practices that we've seen arise in the world around of the gig economy recently, in which we hope we can also give a glimmer of hope on building worker power on some of these issues. Today, we have a very nice lineup of speakers with us today from the International Labour Organization, as well as from researchers from KU Leuven, researchers from the WageIndicator Foundation, and we're hopeful also that all of you here today with us will be engaging in the discussion. We have some time and space to ask questions, of course, and feel free to engage on some of the topics that we will be discussing today. As I said, we are discussing today the issue of unpaid work or unpaid labor, and specifically related to the gig economy. But what is important to note is that the issue of unpaid work has not didn't all of a sudden arise because of the gig economy, but was always there. And what we see now with the rise of the gig economy and platform work is that this issue doesn't necessarily change, but we do see that gig workers come with many more, the gig work comes with many more risks and costs additionally to the nature of the work, and hence we definitely need to discuss this issue of unpaid labor also when it comes to the gig economy. We see that workers start competing, they lower their prices and all of that to enter the market, and therefore we also need to address the downsides of that work. Like I said, we will also have a good practice session at the end after a very nice panel. But first of all, we would like to show you a small video that we made to introduce the topic of unpaid labor. And after that, after the video, I would like to immediately give the floor to Uma Rani from the International Labour Organization. And I'll introduce Uma after the video. Martijn?
Yes, one moment.
Unpaid labor in the platform economy. Most platform workers, if not all, are confronted with the fact that too often they have to work for free, that is, unpaid. This video highlights the most frequent instances of unpaid labor that unprotected platform workers, freelancers and other self-employed face, fight and need to solve. What sort of unpaid labor are we talking about? If unpaid labor is mentioned, then it is usually about waiting time, the time that a worker, mainly in delivery or ride-hailing, needs to wait in between gigs. While in an employment relationship the employer is responsible for the risk of no work, in the platform economy this risk falls squarely on the worker. But there is more. Unpaid labor goes far beyond waiting time and the risk of no work. What are the tasks that platform workers do without receiving compensation for them? Here are some examples. Searching for jobs, bidding on jobs, setting up profiles on online platforms, preparing for a gig, traveling to the job location, buying tools and materials, doing administrative, accounting and customer service work, training and developing new skills, staying in tune with the market, and marketing oneself. Some argue that we need to look at unpaid labor from an even broader perspective. Then even the data one generates while performing a gig, which is then used to feed and improve the platform's algorithms, may be rightfully considered as unpaid labor, since it contributes to the growth of value of the platform. Unpaid labor may be seen as an economic cost for platform workers who pay for something over which they have limited control. But that is not all. There are also social costs associated with platform work. For example, the always-on attitude imposed by the platform's algorithm harms workers' free time, friendships, and family ties. Aren't there solutions, at least some? Many argue that hiring the worker as an employee may solve most issues around unpaid labor, but in reality, especially in global reality, this is more complicated. That's why we need to think further. Why, for instance, not reimburse the expenses for work-related costs? Why not extend labor protection and benefits, such as paid sick leave, health insurance and retirement plans, to include platform workers? Another possible solution would be to give each worker a portable social benefits scheme tied to the individual worker. This would make it easier for workers to multi-home by making data portable while giving them access to important social rights. In the end, it is a shared responsibility for all: platforms, service providers, policymakers, workers and unions, academics and activists, to strive for a fair and balanced future for every working person.
Thanks a lot, Martijn. And Rogerio for making this nice video. With that video, I would very much like to introduce all of you to our keynote speaker of today, which is Uma Rani. Uma is I would say, senior economist, but also senior speaker at our many gig webinars. Uma is a senior economist at the research department of the International Labour Organization, and she has conducted a lot of research over the years on the informal economy, minimum wages, poverty, and inequality issues, also with a gender focus. Since 2016, Uma has been working on the digital transformations in the world of work, where she tries to explore how labor and social institutions could be strengthened to address economic and social inequality. She coordinated the major flagship report of the ILO on World Employment and Social Outlook 2021, the role of digital labor platforms in transforming the world of work. And she has co-edited the special issue on women, work, and the digital economy for gender and development in 2022. And we're very happy to have you here today, Uma, to speak more on issues around unpaid labor in the gig economy. You have the floor.
Thank you so much, Fiona, for your kind words. And let me share my presentation. Okay. I would also like to thank Valeria Pulinano today for inviting me for this webinar, along with Fiona and Martin. So what I'm going to talk to you today is about the hidden costs of gig work, unpaid labor. And I'm going to take off where the video actually left in a way, talking about the fact that unpaid labor is not a new phenomenon. And this is something that has existed in various forms throughout history and across different industries. And we all know about the unpaid internships or apprenticeships that are there not only in industries, but in a number of sectors, including some of the UN organizations. Then you have off-the-clock work, that is, you're arriving early, staying late without pay, and this is often not compensated even when you are in an employment relationship. Then there are, in certain sectors especially, a mandatory overtime without necessarily compensating adequately. And often in some of the sectors where workers move between different job sites or different households, this travel time is often not compensated even within the traditional labor market. And of course, work that is performed by salaried employees outside of contracted hours is another phenomenon where workers are not paid for their work. I think one of the arguments that underpins all of this is that you are in an employment relationship, you do have a job where you are being paid on a monthly basis, and that should be sufficient. And all of that you're talking about is covered by it. But often one fails to realize that many workers actually who do some of these jobs do not necessarily have what is called as a permanent employment relationship or a permanent status which guarantees them a payment or a reward or a salary for the work that they do. In many developing countries, these workers remain as what is called as casual workers, day workers, or temporary workers in a way. So this is something quite in existence even within the traditional labor market for a number of precarious workers per se, not only to those who were, having a fixed term contract or without limit of time contract in one sense. I think the other area which is often forgotten when you get into the debate on the unpaid labor, is the whole, and this is a much longer discussion that has been happening for decades now around gender and unpaid work and the unequal burden. And this is something, here the unpaid labor is very heavily gendered, with women disproportionately carrying out that burden, be it domestic labor, that is childcare or housework or caregiving for family members. And there's also a lot of time that is spent on emotional labor in both personal and professional settings, which is often not recognized in any kind of a setting per se. Now, one can argue that many of these forms of unpaid labor, they do contribute to economic disparities and limit women's opportunities for paid work and career advancement. But equally important as the whole issue is that how this labor and this work, which should be valued in some sense, actually is not actually valued, though it contributes to the country's GDP or productivity of other members of the family. And there's a long-standing debate going on among feminist economic circles about how this should be part of the UNSNA accounts. I think we have made some breakthroughs here, and we are hoping that in the coming years, this would be included within the UNSNA accounts. But the issue still remains: what is going to be accounted for, what is not going to be accounted for? And then there's a second issue: how do you value this work? How is the valuation process that happens? So that's another issue that needs to be taken in. While we are talking about this, we have the new gig economy that comes in, where it is more than just free work. There have been quite a bit of studies in the sociology of work which have pointed out about the role of digital technologies, which have enabled the exploitation of unpaid work, or what you can call it as free labor, that actually contributes to the capital accumulation. Now, even the unpaid labor, even within the freelance and microtask platforms, they contribute to the profits of the platforms and the clients, which is, in a sense, if you want to use a Marxian term, a process of capital accumulation or valorization that takes place. Now, Thompson and Smith, in their work in the late 2000s, actually talk about worker effort or effort power, wherein the workers, and whether it be freelancers or others, they have some sort of a control over how much effort they can invest, and how much and where do they want to actually invest. But what we see increasingly is that the platform dynamics limits their ability to translate this effort into fair compensation. And I guess part of the problem that we are today discussing actually comes from this kind of control mechanism that is, in some sense, embedded within the platforms. Now, if we want to understand unpaid labor within the capital's valorization process, I think one can start with a traditional labor market, which has an employment relationship. But again, within this traditional labor market, you do see unpaid labor coming from employers trying to extract more labor time, that is a surplus, from employees that have been contracted. Now, they could be permanent wage laborers or casual wage laborers or temporary wage laborers, which is very essential for reproducing the labor power. And this is very nicely encapsulated by Cole and colleagues in one of their recent papers. Now, if you move beyond that and look at freelancers who are not traditional employees, Now, their unpaid labor, again, contributes to the value that is generated by platforms, and this is actually captured by clients largely. And the platforms try to extract this unpaid labor by actually compelling freelancers to invest their time beyond what is going to be directly compensated either through tasks, because this, they say or argue, is very essential for them to remain competitive. Now, this competition further is fueled by the platform algorithms, which actually leads to oversupply of labor. And in some sense, what is happening within the platform ecosystem is there is a normalization of this unpaid work as workers, especially freelancers, try to strive for visibility and positive ratings, because these are essential elements for accessing work on these platforms. Now, this is something that has always been on. And I think the blurring of the line between the work and free time, which started happening within the traditional employment relationship, gets even more blurred within the platform work. Because if you're talking about freelance workers, then the boundaries between what is a professional and personal time becomes very difficult to delineate, largely because they operate from home. And I think it's similarly blurred for those who are operating on location-based platforms, where the platform algorithms actually pressurizes these workers to be constantly available and to be responsive, because if they are not on all the time, which you also saw it in the video, you might not get any access to work. And if you don't get access to work, you don't have a good rating. So there is a kind of a virtuous cycle that you very clearly see, irrespective of the platform that one is talking about. Now, this contributes again to the normalization of unpaid labor, as there is a huge pressure to engage in tasks that might not directly at times translate to immediate income. And this is especially so if we are talking about freelancers. And I'll come to in a bit as to why that is so. Now, what is happening within the process, within the entire valorization process, and especially the capital valorization? Now, these platforms are double-sided markets very clearly, and it needs both the workers and the clients to be there to operate on these platforms. Now, how do you attract clients to come onto the market or to the platform to actually engage with workers? So what the platforms do is they give them a hidden discount, which is nothing other than an unpaid labor, which acts as a kind of a subsidy for them, because they subsidize a lot of these costs. Now, this kind of subsidization is problematic in a context, especially where there's intense competition, and in the case of freelancers, where they are unable to factor unpaid time into the pricing. And this is especially so in developing countries. So what happens is they offer low rates to secure projects, they work for free to gain experience, and they accept projects that they might otherwise decline. So this high subsidization actually helps the client very much, who are willing to take on these workers to get the work, but it is at the expense of the worker. It doesn't stop there. The hidden cost, the platforms also shift to the freelancers, and this is done by making them pay for subscription fees or plans, making them pay for the bids, in addition, they also charge a part of the earnings as commission fees for being able to access work. Now, many of these costs in a traditional labor market would be borne by the employer. And interestingly, there's a convention of the Private Employment Agency, Convention 191, which very clearly prohibits any intermediaries to act or agencies to actually collect any type of fees for making work accessible to workers. So this is despite that, you find platforms actually trying to get a huge amount of earnings or revenue through these mechanisms from the workers. Now, this has huge impact on workers, especially in developing countries, which can lead to further disparities in earnings. And I think the final reality of unpaid labor is what is called as the unseen workload, in a way, where a significant amount of unpaid labor is done by workers to secure and maintain work, that is looking for jobs, bidding for projects, creating and updating profiles, portfolios, communicating with the potential clients. And irrespective of the platforms we have seen, whether it's freelance or micro tasks, many of these workers have to complete tests and do a number of trial tasks for which they are not paid. And then they have to deal with client disputes and platform bureaucracy. And all of this requires some sort of a monetary investment for which there's absolutely no returns that these workers get. And I think this is what makes it quite problematic. Let me quickly show you some evidence from the global online labor markets that ILO has been working on. Now, one can argue, and I think this is to a very large extent true, when you're talking about the self-employed in the traditional labor market, there is a lot of control that they have. And they have a control not only with regard to whether they want to do a particular work or not, but also control about what the pricing could be. And many of these workers are able to build in, at least not fully, but partially, a lot of their unpaid work incorporated when they demand for a price. They also compete in that market, but that market is in some sense limited in the sense it is either within a city or a town or within a region. But with the planetary global labor markets, what happens is that you're competing with global workers, and there's a very high competition, and workers are finding it extremely difficult to account for this unpaid work. And we do find that workers on average, at least in the surveys we have conducted, spend about 8 hours per week on this kind of unpaid task. And it's about 28% of the total working time, which is far higher within the developing countries. Like one of the workers said, my accountant told me I must be able to invoice for at least 90% of your time. For me, that came out to only 50%. So that speaks volumes about the difference that exists between a traditional labor market and a platform labor market. And where they do invest is exactly what I said about preparing proposals, promoting themselves, also doing self-studies and participating in competitions and administrative work. Now, this has implications on their earnings. We find that there are large gaps in average hourly earnings, and we have done all permutations and combinations to see, whether things would improve if you look at their location or regularity and all of it. But we find that the total hourly earnings actually dips by about 1/3 the minute you put in unpaid time. And this leads to a polarization of earnings between those in the platform work and those in the traditional work. And for the workers in developing countries, this is far more disadvantageous as they perform quite a lot of unpaid activities. So to conclude, I think moving forward, it would be very important to recognize and value unpaid labor. And I think in this context, what is very important is to understand the historical context of unpaid labor, because that can inform what are the different types of strategies we can adopt to address the contemporary manifestations that we see within the gig economy. Because unpaid labor is a significant but often hidden cost for workers on both location-based and online platforms. And for this, it would be very important to look at platform design, competition, algorithmic management practices, so that we can reduce this prevalence of unpaid labor. And I think addressing many of these issues also requires greater transparency, fairer platform practices, and recognizing the true value of work that is actually performed. And both traditional and online or platform labor markets would require stronger labor protections, enforcement of fair labor standards, and shift also in the societal norms about how we value work and how we would like to compensate all or different types of work that is performed by workers in any kind of a setting that we look at. So with this, let me conclude, and thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much, Uma, for setting the scene for us and also noting the importance of addressing this issue, not from only one sector or one specific issue, but the way that workers work in general and how they get paid. Luckily, today we'll also discuss more about how we can look at pay for gig workers, as well as pay fair pay practices in general. If you have any questions for Uma, please feel free to put them in the chat. We have enough time during the session today to also have a debate together on some of these topics. With that, I would now very much like to introduce our panel of today, which is hosted and moderated by Professor Valeria Pugliano from KU Leuven. Valeria is a professor in sociology at the Center for Sociological Research at KU Leuven, and also one of the main researchers of the almost finalized Perspective project that we will hear more about today. Valeria, I assume you want to introduce the rest of your panel, but allow me to introduce you to the rest of the webinar today. Valeria has published extensively on topics related to the sociology of work, comparative European industrial employment relations, the labor markets and inequality, and also on job quality and workers' voice. She currently serves as principal coordinator of the research network on work, employment, and industrial relations within the European Sociological Association, and she is PI of the ERC Advanced Research Grant Respect Me, where she currently studies the forms of unpaid labor in the platform economy, creative industries, and care, and in the way in which they account for and develop a measurement of precarious work. Valeria, you have a great panel with you today, so please introduce them, your team, or do you want me to introduce them? Also fine.
Oh, that's fine. That's fine. Thank you very much. First of all, thank you very much, Fiona, for the really very nice words and introduction. So yes, we have a fantastic panel today. We have two very great scholars. One is Lorena Poblete, and the other one is Milena Franke. Let me introduce both. First of all, Lorena. Lorena is a researcher at the Consejo Nacional de Investigaciones Científicas y Técnicas, CONICET, and full professor at the Universidad Nacional de San Martín in Argentina. She holds a PhD also in sociology, and she has been visiting as a scholar different universities in Europe. I here mention just a few: Paris, McGill, Université de Nantes, Université de Lille, and so forth. And I think that Lorena has been doing quite interesting work from a labor perspective, looking at the gig economy, and particularly shedding light on one specific issue of this gig work, which is in fact care work in a platform. So I'm really very much looking forward to hear the presentation that Lorena today will be giving to us, particularly in the light of also what Uma mentioned in her keynotes about care work, gender, and unpaid labor. And then the second speaker is a young emerging scholar, a part of the Respect Me team, Milena Franke. She's a postdoctoral researcher on this specific project at the KU Leuven in Belgium. Milena, together also with Claudia Marat, basically, they've been working extensively on the Respect Me project, and therefore, they've been supporting the uncovering the unpaid labor in different platforms across different countries and different sectors in Europe. And Milena has been also kind of writing around unpaid labor, and she just defended her PhD thesis this year on unpaid labor in the platform economy in Belgium. So I would perhaps ask 5 minutes presentation for each presenter. I know Lorena is going to do a short presentation around care and gig and gender. And then Milena is going to present our survey module of Unpaid that we just designed. And she's going to kind of present to us how we have been doing it and what we have been finding so far. So please, Lorena, the floor perhaps is yours first, 5 minutes for each. And then I have a set of questions I would like to pose to you in the light of your presentation. Thank you very much for being with us today, to both.
Thank you very much for the invitation, Valeria and Fiona and Martin, for allowing me to be part of this conversation that is very interesting, I think, and very necessary to have. I will hope that I will contribute to some inputs from Latin American countries, and particularly with a platform that intervene in paid and care work. Paid domestic work evolves in a gray zone where the notion of employment, but also the notion of work, have become increasingly newer. In Latin America, since domestic work has long been considered a natural activity for women, and because of the intimate nature of this type of employment, domestic workers are often referred as part of the family. Thus, payment is not seen as a salary, but a kind of token of appreciation. Therefore, employers consider that the payment is discretionary, then it does not need to be in accordance with labor regulation. This has two major consequences. On the one hand, domestic workers generally receive lower wages than the ones established by the legislation. And on the other hand, many activities required to carry out domestic work are unpaid or partially paid. Based on a study of an Argentina platform offering cleaning service, the aim of this presentation is to reflect on whether digital platform intermediation introduces changes in unpaid work in the sector. To do so, we will focus on the time needed to look for a job, go to work, and complete the task required by the employer. Traditionally, the time needed to work for jobs or the one needed to go to work is unpaid in the sector. However, normally working should be paid. Like most studies on industrial work, I consider the time as an unusual measure to think about paid labor and therefore unpaid labor. The empirical material used is part of the collective research conducted with Francisca Pereira and Ania Tiziani. We use a mixed method approach, and the fieldwork was conducted in the metropolitan area of Buenos Aires at 3 different stages between 2020 and 2022. The first included 20 semi-structured interviews with domestic workers. The second, a quantitative survey of 300 workers conducted in December 2020 and January 21. And the third was 2 groups, a focus group with domestic workers and 4 with employers conducted in June 2020. To understand if this digital platform introduces changes in unpaid labor in domestic work, I compare labor relations mediated by the platform with relations outside the platform. Because in this sector, as Uma said, many parts of the job is normally non-paid. All domestic workers interviewed have both jobs mediated by the platform, but also jobs outside the platform. And sometimes the job mediated by the platform became traditionally jobs later. When we look at the time needed to look for a job, we observe that the digital platform increased this kind of unpaid labor. Most jobs offered by the platform are jobs of less than 5 hours per week. Then domestic workers need to have many jobs to reach a living wage. Additionally, due to the inflation, many workers use the service called for one time only to increase their incomes. Then they are constantly searching for new jobs, regular jobs, or one-time only jobs. This implies to allocated time, they said that it was almost 1 hour or more per day, to have information about new jobs opportunities. When we look at the time needed to go to work, then we observe that the jobs mediated by the platform reduce the commuting. Although domestic workers live far from the zones in which the most jobs are concentrated, due to the algorithm used by the platform, they are able to choose jobs in the same neighborhood within a small distance. And finally, when considering the time needed to complete the task required, there are ambivalent outcomes. the fact that the employer needs to publish a description of the task required within a certain amount of time allow domestic workers to have a clear image of the employer's expectation. Also, the job description could be used by the workers as a framework to limit the time and the task performed. They told us that because the job description is a starting point of the work arrangement, they feel entitled to reject some tasks. However, as it did happen in the case of the jobs outside the platform, domestic workers feel forced to do whatever the employer asks, even if it's in the last minute. Domestic workers report repeatedly that it's very common to receive a phone call from the employer asking to do something else in the 10 or 5 minutes before the working time is finished. Then, because they are afraid or to lose their job or the good reviews or the ranking, they usually stay longer without reclaiming the payment for this extra time. I leave there. I thank you, and we will continue the discussion later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lorena. Very interesting. I will keep the question for later. I will now give the floor to Milena.
Can you see this?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, and you can hear me. Okay, perfect.
Yes.
Thank you very much. Yes, I think I'm not yet in presenter mode. I think this is how it's supposed to be. Yeah, thank you very much also for your introduction, Valeria, and thank you all for having me today. As Valeria said, I'm a postdoctoral researcher in the Respect Me project, and we've been working on unpaid labor. More specifically, I'm going to present what we have been doing in the quantitative part of the Respect Me project, which is developing a measurement of unpaid labor. So I'm presenting this in the name of all of us, Valeria, but also Bert Meuleman, who is currently part of our team. And diving right into it, the Respect Me project is about advancing the theory of and measurement of unpaid labor, of precariousness by focusing on unpaid labor. So we had, first of all, a qualitative research, and that was about developing a novel theoretical perspective of precarity based on unpaid labor. And there we did a number of qualitative narrative interviews focusing on 3 specific sectors: the care sector, the creative sector, and then platform work in 8 different countries. And then there was a second stage, which we are currently developing, where the aim is to develop a valid and standardized measurement, and that is the survey module on unpaid labor, based on the theory we developed in the first part. So it's really a communication between different methods. We do have a qualitative part where we used grounded theory, and then a quantitative survey module based on this theory. So it's like a mixed method, inductive, sequential design that we use to develop the measurement of unpaid labor. This is, of course, comes with its challenges, because, as I mentioned before, we started off from sector-specific experiences of unpaid labor based off these narrative interviews. So we had to start from that, and in order to develop then a set of survey questions. And then also unpaid labor is a multidimensional concept, so it's not easy to measure just with one survey indicator. We needed multiple. So I want to spend the rest of the presentation showing you a little bit what we did. One dimension of unpaid labor, which is very important, which was also mentioned in this first video, is this unpaid, what we call unpaid labor time. So it's, for example, about waiting time, communication with clients, administrative work, traveling between jobs and tasks. And so we presented participants in this survey with a whole range of questions about these different types of unpaid labor time. So first asking them if this is part of their job, and then asking them whether this time is paid for by their employer or by their client. And this was one way to ask about these different kinds of unpaid labor time in our survey module. And then there was another dimension, which we also see as unpaid labor time, is basically asking about overtime, really defined as in accordance with the ILO definition of overtime, and where also respondents could indicate whether they were doing overtime work. The another dimension was unpaid tools or equipment. And there again, we presented our respondents with a whole list of indicators. Transportation, for example, safety equipment, specific clothing or accessories, computer, phone, internet. And there we asked them, first of all, if they use the following things in their jobs, and second, whether their expenses are covered for buying or maintaining these materials. So this is also a dimension of unpaid labor. Both of them, the time and the tools equipment, came from our qualitative research, and we tried to then put them into these survey items to measure them quantitatively. This survey module also contains a whole set of other questions. Some of them, for example, were about the reasons for conducting unpaid labor. And there we also based ourselves on the qualitative module. So, for example, we ask about what we call the inevitability of unpaid labor, but also reward and penalty as motives for doing unpaid labor. For example, some say there is no one else to perform the tasks, so that's why they do unpaid labor. Some people would say it's because they do unpaid labor because it would help my career. For example, as an example of reward or penalty, such as not doing unpaid work would make me feel guilty. So we measure all of these kinds of drivers of unpaid labor as well. And next to that, the survey module also contains a range of socio-demographic characteristics such as gender, age, education, gender being very important, as Lorena mentioned, job-related characteristics, sector, occupation, for example, how many working hours, how much autonomy at work, and then also some kind of outcomes or consequences that we hypothesize would be related to unpaid labor, such as mental health, work-life balance, etc. So this is the survey module that came out of our qualitative, that we developed based on the qualitative research, and which we are currently analyzing. We see a lot of variation, both across the countries. So we currently conducted the survey in the UK, in France, in Sweden, and the Netherlands, and also across different sectors and occupations. So I'm going to conclude here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Milena, also for presenting to us what effectively we have been doing. And we know we have some results, but these are under development at the very moment. So, I mean, I would like to probably have still 15 minutes left. I look at Fiona and Martijn.
About 10 to 15, yes.
Okay, great. Okay, so we have to basically be very short, but I would like to pose some questions based on these two presentations, and also, you know, based on the keynote of Uma and the video we have looked at. So first of all, I would like to pose a question to Lorena. Lorena, you, in your presentation, you actually highlighted the kind of novelty that you know, we see in terms of what this unpaid labor is about in the gig economy in comparison to what unpaid labor could have been, you know, in the outside kind of digital world. And I wanted basically to ask, in your study, since it goes on care platforms and particularly on a particular group of people like women, how do you see these unpaid labor relating to another important traditional dimension of unpaid labor, which is the socially reproductive one? In other words, in the video, we have seen also that one of these dimensions is how this unpaid done in paid employment could affect also the family, could affect the household. So could you tell us about how this unpaid labor in your specific situation affects socially reproductive unpaid labor for women done traditionally in a normal household? Do you see any specific insight in there you want to tell us?
Well, what I see in this study, as I show in the presentation, we see ambivalent effects of the platform in this type of care work because unpaid labor, but care work or domestic work, it's so as unpaid labor. And this is kind of a cultural notion that is continuing to be the primary notion in Latin America. And when, even if most countries in Latin America do the new legislation after the convention was adopted in 2011, the notion of domestic work and care work is it's shown in the legislation as a non-profit labor. And in that case, it reinforced the idea of this kind of labor not to need to be valued or paid as another kind of job. And then this overlapping of notion improved the naturalization of this job as unpaid. And then when this kind of job goes through the platforms, I think that what we saw is that the reinforcement of tendencies that are already in the sector since forever, I would say. And but as you show as it was shown in the video and Uma told, platform work visualize better the part of unpaid work in this sector. It helps us to show what happened and how this kind of job must be valued and remunerated. Yeah, even if platform contributes to more unpaid, to increase unpaid work, it would be also to give us this opportunity to talk about or to think about solutions on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think what you're saying is quite interesting. So on the one hand, it seems that, there is a kind of exacerbating effect of the unpaid labor and the kind of eating effect of the unpaid labor as a value for care work. But on the other hand, you seems to be quite, positive in saying, okay, because the gig economy makes visible the transaction, the economic transaction, we now have the possibility to show up that there is something wrong here. So that's very interesting. And I just want to shift to Milena then. I mean, how do you think, Milena, that our measurement module that we have been developing, probably because of these, visibility of the economic transaction, how this can help policymakers and researchers in general to make this unpaid labor that Lorena is talking about much more visible?
Thank you, Valeria. I think it can definitely help both. You mentioned both the policy makers and the researchers. So it is important to have this measurement to be able to quantify unpaid labor as an essential part of job quality, and this module makes it possible to first of all quantify unpaid labor, but also again to link it to other characteristics of the workforce to see where it is most prevalent, and then that's also then relevant not only for the researchers but also for the policymakers, to also see that the different forms of unpaid labor might vary between different groups. So unpaid labor for an employee, for example, is different than for a freelancer, and that we are able to quantify and show that. And then to develop specific policy initiatives about that. We've always discussed that the employment contract might be an issue, but there might also be other things going on here. So there might be specific regulation necessary for the freelancers, for example, to mitigate their exposure to unpaid labor. So I think our module helps to both showcase the prevalence of unpaid labor and also maybe design specific policy measures targeted at more groups where it's more prevalent and different forms of unpaid labor that might be more prevalent as well.
Thank you, Milena. Could you give us some very concrete example? I know the analysis is ongoing, but we do have something. Could you give us just very shortly some example of what you're saying? Based on our the analysis we have been doing so far, of what you're saying.
We know, for example, that let me get back to one of the documents I have. Yes. For example, unpaid overtime, we had a discussion about this, and this was both varied in terms of kinds of occupations, but also the countries where we find this in. We had, for example, unpaid overtime being very prevalent in the UK. This also reflects back on the kind of system and institutions that is behind there, whether unpaid overtime is compensated there or not. This might be one example. Or also the fact that we have different groups of unpaid labor depending on what kind of costs are compensated for. Some people might see that their work equipment is compensated for, and others, and that falls then out of the contract that they have with clients in the case of freelancers, for example. Whereas for the employees, we see that their costs are mostly covered. And then indeed we are in the process of analyzing whether these differences then keep being different across the different sectors and groups if we also control for other variables, such as gender, for example, such as the kind of tasks.
Okay, that's very interesting. I think we also have a lot of linkage what Uma said at the very beginning about these difficulties of freelancer to be able to get back or to have this return on the effort that they make when they engage in platform work. So this is really fascinating. Okay, I want to go back to Lorena and again back to the care platform issue. Lorena, in our study on care platforms, which was very much concentrated into a couple of European countries, we have been arguing, and that there is a lot of informality of labor, which is in fact coming out of these gig work performed through digital platforms in Europe. Now, how does it work in the, for example, Global South and your country, Argentina? I mean, we know that Argentina is very, as many other Global South countries, there is a lot of informality of labor. So how does it work there? How would you assess the informality, formality, or / formality, which is created by gig platforms, particularly on care?
Well, we started in Latin America. We started in the sector with levels of formalization that are really very, very low. In most of the countries, formalization rates goes between 5 and 10% of domestic workers. In the better cases, like in Argentina, domestic workers are 25%, but 25% of domestic workers are formal workers and entitled to some rights, not always all the rights, because it's difficult for them to have an effective enforcement of rights. But then we started with this structure of labor markets, and then platform arrived. And for me, the question is not just yes or no, platform contribute to formalization or informalization. We need to see what platform do exactly in different scenarios. For instance, the platform we study in Argentina, they offer 3 types of service. One is a regular contract, but the mediation for a regular contract with the employer, but managed by the platform. The second is a regular contract with the employer, but managed by the employer. And the third one is what all the platform create kind of a side product is called the one-time only jobs that we're creating for a small business or for people who are moving and needed 1 day of cleaning, but not wanted to engage in a labor relation. And when we started, what happened in each time of service, we saw a great number of legal contracts. In the case of the service, the employer took the service for a regular job managed by the platform. Because the platform registered the domestic worker in the Social Security service, do the monthly payment of Social Security, the payroll, and pay the domestic workers. And in that case, we see not only formalization as a number of the how many contracts are registered, but also certain rights are more easily to be enforced. For instance, overtime. Because in that case, when domestic workers do overtime, or when domestic workers who work 3 hours a week for the same employer have a holiday in their working day, the platform automatically pay that day. But when the relation is managed by the employer, then the formalization rate is lower, and also the enforcement is more bric-a-brac. Ad hoc decisions, employers change the date of the working day for not to pay for holidays or all these kind of things. And what was very surprising for us when we did the focus group with the employers was that this product that we thought that it was kind of a marginal product, the just one only jobs, were frequently used for the employers to avoid any engagement as such. And some of them, they said, okay, until I find the right domestic worker, I will hire many as it's possible in this with this service, but it's completely informal because regulation didn't cover casual work. But it's surprisingly that this product will be usually used by the employers to avoid their responsibilities, create more informal relation. That are not only informal because they are not registered, but also because they are uncertain in terms of how many days, how many weeks, and the uncertainty about the wages, the incomes of domestic work. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, very interesting. Also the complexity. Perhaps just one last question to wrap up, and just 1 minute each. Then, in the light, Lorena, what you just said, what would you advise from a policy perspective to the, for example, Argentinian government about, how to deal with the gig work and the platform economy in the care sector, and what you would perhaps advise to the, formal, in comma, labor market providers of care in the normal labor market?
I think that we need to continue with the path in which we already have a good legislation, and then many experimentations around enforcement to not to only to go up in the numbers of workers registered, but also in the effectiveness of the enforcement of their rights. But I think that policymakers could think about the platform as a tool to enforce labor rights. There are some non-government agencies or business that were used to capture taxes over the time for employees. How we cannot think about platform and legislation around platforms to use them to contribute to better working conditions and the acknowledgement of domestic workers' rights. Not easy. Not very many people would be willing to do that, but maybe technology could help in a way to that. Thank you.
But we need to shape the technology, of course, right? Not leave the technology operating for us. So role for the stakeholders, and particularly the trade unions, I would say there, but also our government. And very, very quickly, Milena, do you want to add anything on top of what Lorena already said?
About advising,
About it, yeah.
Yeah, also just acknowledging unpaid labor as an important dimension and seeing that it's not the same across all sectors of the economy, and also these costs because I mean it's always hard to talk about unpaid labor in terms of costs as well, but that they also should feature in the unpaid labor debate, definitely.
Yeah, I think this is a very nice closing. I mean, really introducing unpaid labor as a dimension of job quality. That's also what we are trying to do in our work. And I think probably we can join forces with a lot of researchers doing that. Well, I think time is out. So I will pass over to Martijn, I think. But I would like to thank very much Lorena and Milena for your very interesting presentation and discussion. It's been really a pleasure. And if for the people who are, listening to us, if you want to pose question to Lorena and Milena, please do it in the chat because we don't have time to discuss online directly. So Martijn, the floor is yours now. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Valeria. I'm going to take it over for Martijn first before I give it to Martijn. I just wanted to quickly give the floor to Uma to perhaps respond to the question from Thomas that was asked in the chat. Which if the others who are still in the panel also want to reflect on that, feel free to do so before we head into the best practices.
Thanks, Fiona. I think Thomas has this question about, the work or how the freelancers or workers spend quite a bit of time studying or for their education or upskilling. And the whole question is about who takes the responsibility and where is it accounted? This is very clearly in our analysis accounted as part of the unpaid work. And within the platform work per se, of course, it's the freelancers who take the responsibilities. But even within the traditional labor market, there's a big debate coming up now as to, who's going to bear the cost of upskilling, reskilling, and all of that, whether it's the employer or whether it's a worker or whether it's going to be shared. So this is a very important question, and it opens up a huge debate as we move forward, especially with the future of work and the digital economies where a lot of reskilling is required, and who's going to bear the cost for it. But within the platform economy, it is the workers who bear the cost, clearly.
Thanks a lot, Uma. Is there anybody from the panel who wants to do a small reflection on this? Perhaps Valeria? And otherwise, we move on to the next session.
I will just, I fully agree with Uma that the issue of, reskilling, upskilling, whatsoever is very important. And of course, the responsibility within an employment relationship of the employers is, a crucial issue that we should be engaged in discussing, particularly within an economy in which, things became so volatile and nobody knows who is doing what. So it's important to really reconvene conversation around these kind of issues. So I fully agree with Uma on that. Thank you, Uma, for raising. Yeah.
Great. Thanks a lot, everybody. Okay, before we head into our best practices session, I would also like to highlight, because we initially had that planned for this session, but we felt it was better to just give a small introduction on this work. WageIndicator and NIPI have been partnering, and now also the Respect Me team from KU Leuven have been partnering together to start analyzing the over 15,000 data points and interviews from unique gig workers that we have been gathering, that NIPI has been gathering over across the Latin American continent. And our collective goal together with KU Leuven, WageIndicator and NIPI is to get more insights into the earnings and the behaviors of gig workers that are on the NIPI platform, such as gig workers that are working in delivery or as taxi workers. And we currently have, like I mentioned, over 15,000 unique data points from gig workers across Argentina, Brazil, Colombia, the Dominican Republic, Mexico, and Peru, who work over 18 different platforms. And the first analysis that we have done so far on the data is that we see that almost 20% now currently earn less than the expected earnings based on living wage estimates. And we are intending to benchmark this on our WageIndicator living tariff, where we expect that this gap becomes even larger, because the living tariff, which will be introduced in the next session, is a much higher estimate for a living wage than the living wage. And we will be working on further analysis on this data together with the data team. And if you guys have any questions on this work so far, please feel free to reach out to our colleague Intan, who's also in the room here today, who's working on the first analysis. And feel free to reach out to us if you have any other questions on that work. But we're happy to take on pieces of the work that have been done by the team at KU Leuven and together with NIPI to explore this further and better understand the dynamics of pay there. That being said, I would very much like to thank our lovely panel for all your amazing insights and important notes. And I would like to introduce with that our next speakers of today, which is Martijn Arets and Nadia Pralitasari, both from the WageIndicator team. Martijn is an international expert and thinker in the field of emergence and development of the platform economy. He's part of the WageIndicator gig team, and he's also he's also part of the platform economy research group at the Hague University of Applied Sciences. And the founder of Gig CV, which is an easy tool for anyone working in or gaining work experience in the gig economy. I don't know if somebody wants to speak, but and we also have with us Nadia, who is a labor expert with Gajimu Indonesia, the WageIndicator Indonesian team. Nadia is a labor advocate and data collection specialist with over a decade of experience in the labor market and doing labor market related research. She has actively contributed to the research and development of the WageIndicator living tariff tool in Indonesia. And she currently manages all of WageIndicator's global language team, which is a massive operation, which she oversees over 208 countries in the world. Martijn and Nadia, you have the floor. And Luis, I will get back to you right after this session, okay? But please feel free to ask your questions in the chat.
So, okay, thank you very much. And also thank you very much to the previous speakers of the contributions. Really interesting to see. And I think one part of it is also to make visible on so what are the different variables and elements of unpaid work, because if they're visible, then you can talk about it and work on it. So I think this making visible is really important. And within this last part of this session, we're going to highlight two good practices, which in the end can contribute to more awareness on unpaid work in the gig economy, but also ways on how to solve it. So we're going to talk about two cases. The first is the living tariff, which is a concept by a WageIndicator, which in the end suggests to make visible on a case. So what are the unpaid labor, different variables that comes to different kind of gig work, and what price tag are you going to hang on it? So in the end, how are you going to calculate it? How to compensate the worker correctly? And then the second one will be GigCV, which is my or one of my projects that facilitates the data sharing with gig workers, and data sharing was also one of the parts also discussed before. But first, I want to give the floor to Nadia from Indonesia, who is going to explain more about the living tariff concept of WageIndicator, also from the Indonesian perspective.
Okay, thank you, Martijn. So allow me to share my screen. So did you all see the screen?
Yes, perfect.
Okay. Okay, so hello everyone. I'm Nadia from WageIndicator Foundation. I'm based in Jakarta, Indonesia. So today, learning and hearing all the keynote speaker and then the panelists for today's session, I'm super excited to introduce our WageIndicators Living Tariff Tool. So today I'll share experience of how this tool is making a difference for gig workers and also explore its potential to drive improvement in gig workers' working conditions. So to give you some of the background, so gig economy has grown rapidly in the recent years, but of course, with this growth comes several challenges. So gig workers are often labeled as partners, independent contractors, leaving them without basic worker rights and protections. Also, in many countries, labor laws haven't fully adapted to meet the gig workers' needs. And it's also tough for gig workers to determine the fair tariff, especially with hidden costs and also changing market conditions. And to tackle these challenges, WageIndicator has created the Living Tariff Tool to help gig workers calculate the fair tariff based on their living expenses and other hidden costs, which we hope providing a practical guide to what fair tariff should look like. So to better understand the Living Tariff Tool, let me briefly show you how it works. So if you open the link for the Living Tariff Tool on the first page, you can select your region, platform, and also type of work. The tool then calculates the basic living wage for that region using the data that we collected from our WageIndicator cost of living surveys. Like here, for example, a creative workers in Maharashtra, India would have their living wage of 133 rupees per hour, or 25,741 rupees per month. And on the second page, aside from the living wage in the region, for the gig workers in particular, there are hidden costs that are sometimes overlooked or difficult to calculate, such as work-related equipment. This includes laptops, vehicles, and its maintenance, and also overhead costs, including costs of the time spent doing administrative work, training time, waiting time, and so forth. Still in the second page, there are other components such as taxes and social security also in the mix. And from there, we add the 4 components where it forms a benchmark for a standard minimum tariff for gig workers to do creative work in Maharashtra, India. So the total here is 155 rupees per hour, up from before 133 rupees per hour earlier. But again, we understand that every worker's situation is unique. That is why the tool also allows the users to adjust the variables on the third page. So we can customize the cost of work-related equipment or administrative time to get a more personalized calculations by filling in the customizable boxes like here and also here. So due to time constraint, after the webinar, I encourage you to try out the living tariff tool for more details. I will share the link for you to try it yourself after the presentation. So let me flash back a bit on how the living tariff tool has been developed. So the living tariff tool has been launched in several countries, including Indonesia, Pakistan, Kenya, India, and also the Netherlands. We had discussions with stakeholders in these countries, including unions and employers, about its potentials. And here are some of their views about the living tariff tool. Hope you can see the quotes. So here, the employer in Pakistan says that the concept of living tariff could promote transparency and fairness, and also better understand the true costs of labor. And for Transport Workers Union in Kenya, sees the tool as a way to advocate for fair pricing to platform companies and government, while gig workers appreciate how it simplifies their effort to calculate a fair tariff for their services, especially for a newcomer to freelancing. However, while some of the gig workers may have a clearer idea of what their tariff should be, there are still many of the workers that struggle to negotiate the tariff with the platform that they work for, especially in ride-hailing and delivery services. So this highlights the gap between knowing exactly what the fair tariff is and being able to secure it, really. So based on the interview with the gig workers, the living tariff tool can make impact in several ways. So the first one is the tool can help the gig workers to calculate a sustainable income that covers their living expenses. It also helps gig workers to negotiate for a tariff, for fair tariff, directly to their clients, and also assist those in the platform in making informed decision by comparing the ideal tariff with the platform tariff. The living tariff tool also could promote awareness among gig workers about their rights, and hopefully it's also encouraged them to join the trade union for a stronger collective bargaining power. So I share a bit on the ongoing advocacy effort in Indonesia because I'm based in Indonesia. So the advocacy effort here have been focused more on building the workers' community and strengthening the trade unions. Quite some organization has conducted research and campaigns to highlight the challenges faced by the gig workers. Now we see more and more emergence of grassroots organization like the Indonesian Online Driver Alliances, ADO and Serdadu, and also Sindikasi, a trade union focused on creative and media workers. In terms of workers' movement, there also have been a large scale of protests where the ride-hailing drivers demand more transparent pricing policies and government regulation of employment status for gig workers. These movements have pressured the companies, the platform companies and policymakers to address the concern of the gig workers, though we don't have a significant change have been made yet. And finally, in relation with the living tariff tool, the ride-hailing communities have started using it as a reference to negotiate with the government on the fair tariff limits for online drivers that include setting up the upper and lower tariff based on the region that they are located in. So, and the other things is we also planning to collaborate with freelance platform companies to provide a salary guide for their platform workers, helping the freelancers to set a fair prices based on their region living tariff. So not only living wage, but living tariff. So yeah, that's about it. So we hope the living tariff tool will make a positive contributions for the gig workers worldwide. Thank you for your attention and feel free to reach out if you have any questions. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Nadia, for your contribution, and also interesting to learn more about the perspective in Indonesia, and also the conversation we had also with different stakeholders within debate. So thanks very much. And if you have any questions, you can also ask them to Nadia in the chat. And I also shared a blog and a podcast we made by WageIndicator about the living tariff concepts and the tool. So thanks very much. And then I will do the last presentation. I will share my screen one moment. It's on data sharing. Oops. It's mentioned a lot in the debates because workers, they are creating data while working via the platform. This data is being used by platforms to optimize their systems, and but also being used as a kind of a lock-in to keep workers attracted to the platform. And yeah, the solution that many people say is then, okay, then give the worker their data and they're free. And in practice, it's a little bit more nuanced than that, which I'm going to present about in the cases of GigCV. So if you look at the gig work and discussion, there are of course different kind of gig works, and also the impact of the algorithm also has quite some consequences for how precarious the worker is. But most of the times, how more on demand the transaction, how bigger the impact of the technology on the worker. And there we have a challenge, because in the end we all see, okay, this platform to make it easier for people to enter labor markets. It's a nice first step, but there's no perspective. And there we also see that the data that workers are gathering while executing work via the platform. So we call this a reputation system, but also transaction data on how many gigs did you do, what kind of skills did you use, this kind of stuff. This also in the end contributes to a reputation profile, and with good ratings you get more work, and in some cases also a better or less worse pay. The only problem is also that these systems are also used as a lock-in because you can't take the data with you to other platforms. So within the platform it works really well for you, but it's only in the platform. So there are lots of different stakeholders say, okay, but then what's when you give this data to the worker? Because by that giving the data, you also empower the position of the worker within the labor markets. But in the end, yeah, it's still lots of theory and no practice. So that's the reason why I started a research a couple of years ago, also supported by different stakeholders in the debates, because I thought, okay, the stakeholders that need to have an opinion on this also needs to contribute to this. And this in the end led to a report on data portability. And what I there saw is there were quite some initiatives, commercial initiatives, that were trying to build such a system of data portability or different data wallets, like Trust Cloud, Deemly, Traded, E-Rated. I've almost interviewed them all if they were still there. It really looks really fancy, but in the end, they all failed. So I was also doing research on, okay, so why did they fail? And what I discovered was, when you're talking about data portability, and where you go to talk with an expert about that it will be complicated in about 10 seconds. And this complexity is a kind of a snowball that gets bigger and bigger. And by the end, that also makes those systems fail. So I decided to do it different, to build a system that didn't do anything with complexity. So in the end, what we designed is a data sharing standard on how platforms share data, facilitated with a API and some legal documents. So in the end, GigCV itself doesn't have any data, but we facilitate in data transaction. And this also contributes to a much easier system to maintain, and also much cheaper. So, and that's led to GigCV, or KlusCV in Dutch, which aims to give every platform worker a personal GigCV for free, of course. It looks like this. This is a Dutch version. where the data that the platform has on the worker about reputation and transaction is gathered into a PDF, which the worker then can use at different places in the labor markets. So where are we right now? So over 100,000 workers now can download the gig CV. It's active on 4 different platforms, operating Netherlands, Belgium, Germany, UK, France, Kenya, and Uganda. There were 35,000 downloads, and we are doing researches on this case study right now. We do this from 4 different perspectives. The worker, so the worker that earns the data, I need to bring it with it. The client and employer, so the receiver of the data, because when the receiver of the data doesn't value the data, then it's worthless. So it's nice when you can take your data with you, but if the client doesn't want to hire you sooner because of the data, yeah, then it's the question, why do you want to have the data? On the platform perspective, to see, okay, so why are these platforms sharing data? We're looking from GigsV, but also other initiatives like Ogaru in Colombia, a domestic cleaning platform that also shares data with the workers, and also more a societal perspective. So what we did, for example, was a questionnaire. So all the platforms that are using the GigsV API also apply on collaborating in independent academic research on data portability. So one of the things we did was a questionnaire via the platforms on the workers to ask, okay, so what kind of data do you want to bring with you? Do you want to take this data with you at all? But also a big experiment on their platform clients to see if a imported rating from another platform contributes to the hiring intention of the clients, to see, okay, what is the value of this data, which is also published within this article. And from that perspective, the coming years, we're going to do more research to get a more better informed discussion on this data portability. So some conclusions in this. In the end, I had quite some presentations with lots of lawyers in the audience, and they all say, "Oh, it's complex." And then I said, no, not complex. If you want to share, it's easy. It's no rocket science. If you don't want to share, then you make it complex. So in the end, it's also a matter of priorities and willing to share. Because in the end, data sharing via APIs is also in the core of every platform company. So for every platform company, it's easy to share. So it's more about willing and not being able of. I'm also trying to advocate a bit more the message about, okay, so a login based on keeping your data is an extra weakness. So can we also create business cases where the service of a platform to a worker gets better when they are sharing data? So there are also now some platforms advertising to workers, okay, if you work via our platform, then you can also get your data with you whenever you want. I think it's also a more societal discussion and also research we do is to think about, okay, it's nice to make data portable for workers that already have worked via platforms. So for them, it becomes easier to work at different places, but it also makes maybe in the end, the threshold for new workers bigger that have no data at all. So that's also a discussion we need to have. Within this, to also conclude, what we also see is that there are also within legislation also more a shift from data sharing on demand, like GDPR, to real-time data sharing. So we also try to advocate with platforms, okay, this is also something where the legal landscape is heading to. So maybe if you just use the API of GigsV or build it yourself, then in the end, you also comply to this regulation. So this was a really quick my contribution about how you can make data sharing possible in practice, and how you then also can maybe reduce just little parts of the unpaid labor discussion.
Thanks a lot, Martijn and Nadia as well in your in the session on some of the best practices and things that we can also do in practice after we've heard from some of the researchers. I'm conscious of the fact that we are already at time, but I do would like to note a little bit the discussion that has been going on in the chat, because I think it's an important discussion specifically on, and it's something that Nadia has also pointed out, which is the role of trade unions and organizing gig workers in all of this discussion, because what comes out of the Respect Me research is that the algorithm basically decides, and just a simple contract between a worker and an employer cannot per se fix this. The issue of unpaid labor, what we've seen and what we're trying to do from WageIndicator is to give the living tariff tool as an empowerment tool to workers themselves to understand how much they could potentially earn on the platform. And I think the role of trade unions in organizing gig workers and getting them together is extremely important. So I see all of your comments in the chat on the role of unions and how important this is. I feel like we have a further discussion that needs to be held around all of this. So we will definitely continue this conversation. I'm not sure if Shantanu is still in the room. Yes, he is. We have, as always, because we continue having gig webinars or webinars around issues around the gig economy. Our next gig webinar is happening on the 28th of March next year. And next year we will specifically be focusing on issues around AI that is affecting gig workers. And our first session will, in the March webinar, will circulate most likely around ghost workers and ghost work and the role of AI therein. And if you would like to know more about unpaid labor, please continue to follow Valeria's team at KU Leuven, as well as us in all of the work that will come up. Please feel free to reach out to any of the professors or researchers that were part of the webinar today. We thank you for your time in being part. And I feel like there's a new session of that we need to have still on unpaid labor to continue the discussion. But for now, given that it's time, I would very much like to thank all of our speakers that were here with us today, as well as the very nice and active audience. And hope to see you next year, definitely, but perhaps already sooner at the next gig webinar session.